Susan Parker had always believed some marriages ended with a fight. Others ended with betrayal. And some ended with silence. She just never expected hers would end with a birthday cake. On the morning of her 62nd birthday, Susan woke up before sunrise. That wasn't unusual. For nearly 40 years, she'd been the first person awake in the house. Coffee maker on. Curtains opened. Breakfast started. Some habits become part of your bones. The house was quiet. Her husband, Michael, was still asleep upstairs. Outside, a soft spring rain tapped against the kitchen window. Susan smiled as she poured herself coffee. 62. The number sounded strange. Not old. Just unexpected. How had it happened so fast? One minute she was helping her children with homework. The next she had grandchildren sending her birthday texts. Life moved differently after 50. Faster. Much faster. She was standing by the sink when her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter Emily. "Happy birthday, Mom. Call me later." A few seconds later, another arrived. Her son, Jason. "Don't let Dad forget the cake this year." Susan laughed. Because Michael forgot something every year. Anniversaries. Dentist appointments. Grocery lists. The man could misplace his glasses while wearing them. But he always remembered birthdays. Always. Or at least, he used to. By noon, Susan had already heard from friends. Neighbors, former co-workers. Even an old college roommate she hadn't spoken to in years. The only person she hadn't really talked to yet was Michael. Talked to. He'd kissed her on the cheek that morning, said happy birthday, then disappeared into his home office. Susan told herself not to read into it. People got busy. Life happened. Not everything meant something. Still, something felt off. The feeling stayed with her all afternoon. Like a song playing quietly in another room. You couldn't quite hear it, but you knew it was there. That evening, Emily and Jason came over for dinner. The dining room filled with laughter. Stories. Birthday cards. The smell of roast chicken. For a little while, everything felt normal. Comfortable. Safe. The way family gatherings were supposed to feel. Then dessert arrived. Chocolate cake. Susan's favorite. 62 candles would have been ridiculous, so Emily settled for 2. 1-6. 1-2. Everyone laughed. Michael smiled. But Susan noticed something strange. His smile never reached his eyes. And for some reason, that scared her. After dinner, Emily and Jason left. The dishes were done. The house became quiet again. Michael stood near the living room window, looking out into the darkness. Susan watched him for several seconds, then finally asked, "Okay." Michael turned. "Okay, what? What's wrong?" The question hung between them. Michael looked away first. Never a good sign. "We need to talk." Susan felt her stomach drop. Not because of the words. Because of the tone. Nobody ever says we need to talk before delivering good news. Michael sat down. Susan remained standing. Some instinct told her not to sit. As if sitting would make this real. Michael rubbed his hands together. Then sighed. Then tried again. Finally, he said, "I'm not happy." The words landed softly, but somehow hit like a truck. Susan stared at him. "What does that mean?" Michael swallowed. "It means I've been unhappy for a long time." 1,000 responses raced through her mind. None of them came out. Finally she managed. "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael laughed bitterly. "I don't know." And strangely, Susan believed him. Because sometimes people hide things so long, they forget how to explain them. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Neither of them yelled. Neither of them cried. That would have been easier. Instead, there was honesty. Painful honesty. The kind that arrives years too late. Michael admitted he'd felt lost. Restless. Old. invisible, like he was watching his life instead of living it. Susan listened, quietly, trying to understand, trying not to break apart. Then Michael finally said the sentence that changed everything. "There's someone else." The room went completely still. Susan stared at him, not speaking, not moving, just staring. Because suddenly every strange feeling from the past year made sense. Every late meeting, every unexplained weekend trip, every moment he'd seemed somewhere else. Now, she knew where, and who. Her name was Ashley, 37 years old. Worked for a marketing company Michael had consulted with. Funny, energetic, adventurous. Everything Michael suddenly seemed desperate to become. Susan listened without interruption, then asked one question. Just one. "Do you love her?" Michael closed his eyes. The hesitation answered before the words did. "Yes." Susan nodded slowly, then stood up, walked into the kitchen, and stared at the birthday cake still sitting on the counter, half-eaten. Candles melted. A celebration that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. 3 weeks later, the divorce papers arrived. 40 years of marriage reduced to signatures. Dates. Legal language. Boxes to check. The process moved surprisingly fast. As if the system had done this so many times, it no longer noticed heartbreak. Susan signed quietly. Michael signed quietly. And just like that, a life ended. The hardest moment came a month later. Not in court. Not at the lawyer's office. Not during the move. It happened at a restaurant. Susan was having lunch with Emily when she saw them. Michael, Di, and Ashley. Across the room. Laughing together. Looking happy. Looking new. For a moment Susan couldn't breathe. Not because Ashley was younger. Not because Michael had moved on. Because he looked like a version of himself she'd never seen before. And she wasn't sure if that hurt, or if it made her sad. That night, Susan sat alone in the house. The house felt enormous now. Every room echoed. Every photograph felt different. Every memory felt heavier. For 40 years she'd known exactly who she was. A wife. A mother. A partner. Now? She wasn't sure. The silence seemed to ask a question she couldn't answer. Who are you when the life you built disappears? And for the first time since she was 22 years old, Susan Parker had absolutely no idea for the first few weeks after the divorce. Susan barely left the house. Not because she couldn't, because she didn't know what to do with herself. For 40 years, her life had been built around routines. Michael's coffee. Family dinners. Holiday plans. Weekend errands. The 1,000 little things that quietly become a marriage. Now the routines were gone, and nobody warns you how loud an empty house can be. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee. Silence. A glance at the empty chair across the kitchen table. Then, more silence. Emily called often. Jason checked in regularly. Friends invited her out. Susan usually declined. Not because she wanted to be alone, because she was exhausted. Heartbreak is strange. You can sleep 10 hours and still feel tired. One rainy Saturday afternoon, Susan decided to clean the attic. She wasn't trying to be productive. She simply needed something to do. Anything. The attic was packed with decades of life. Old Christmas decorations. Boxes of photographs. Children's school projects. Forgotten furniture. Dust. Lots of dust. Susan smiled as she worked through the clutter. Then she found a cardboard box tucked behind an old bookshelf. A box she hadn't opened in nearly 40 years. The moment she lifted the lid, she froze. Inside were sketchbooks, paintbrushes, watercolors, portfolio folders, her artwork, hundreds of drawings. Hundreds. Carefully preserved. Untouched. Forgotten. Susan slowly sat down on the attic floor. Suddenly 23 years old again. Before she met Michael, Susan had wanted to illustrate children's books. Not casually. Not as a hobby. Seriously. It had been her dream. She'd studied art. Built a portfolio. Applied to publishers. Spent nights drawing characters and stories. Then life happened. Marriage. Children. Bills. Debt. Responsibilities. The dream slowly moved aside. Then disappeared completely. Not because Michael stopped her. He didn't. Susan simply kept choosing other things first. Family. Work. Everyone else. Until one day, she stopped choosing herself at all. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the old drawings. Talking animals. Fantasy landscapes. Storybook characters. Ideas she'd completely forgotten. And then she found an envelope. Yellow with age. Still sealed. Susan frowned. Carefully opened it. And began reading. Halfway through the letter, her eyes filled with tears. Not from sadness. From shock. 40 years earlier, a children's publisher had written back. They loved her portfolio. They wanted a meeting. A real meeting. An opportunity. A chance. But the letter had arrived only weeks before her wedding. The chaos of moving and planning a future must have buried it. She never saw it. Never responded. Never even knew it existed. Susan sat there for a very long time, holding a future she never realized she'd missed. Some people would have become angry. Susan didn't. Life wasn't that simple. She loved her children. She loved the life she'd built. She didn't regret them. But, for the first time, she allowed herself to mourn a version of herself she'd left behind. That evening Emily came over, found her mother surrounded by sketchbooks. Paints. Memories. What happened here? Susan laughed softly. I think I found someone. Emily looked confused. Who? Susan smiled. The woman I used to be. Over the next few weeks, something changed. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Just little things. Susan started drawing again. At first for 10 minutes. Then 20. Then an hour. Then entire afternoons disappeared. And for the first time in months, she stopped thinking about Michael. Not because she'd moved on. Because she was busy becoming someone. One afternoon, Emily showed up holding a flyer. Mom, that. Susan looked up. What? Emily handed it over. Community illustration. Workshop. Bharat. 6-week program. Local artists. Guest publishers. Portfolio reviews. Susan immediately shook her head. No. Emily rolled her eyes. You haven't even read it. I'm 62. So? Susan laughed. That's usually where inspirational speeches start. Emily grinned. Good. Then I'm right on schedule. A week later, Susan walked into the workshop. Terrified. There were people everywhere. Young artists. Middle-aged artists. Retired artists. Professional artists. People who looked like they belonged. And one woman who felt completely out of place. At least that's what Susan thought. Until she sat down and realized everyone else looked nervous too. The instructor was a man named Daniel Brooks. 65. Gray hair. Kind eyes. Paint stains on his shirt. The sort of person who looked permanently comfortable. Daniel welcomed everyone. Then smiled. You know what the biggest lie about creativity is? The room went quiet. Daniel shrugged. That there's an expiration date. Several people laughed, including Susan. Over the following weeks, Daniel became one of her favorite people. Not because he flirted, Not because he rescued her. Because he listened. Really listened. When Susan talked about illustration. When she talked about fear. When she talked about starting over. Daniel never rushed to fix anything. He simply paid attention. Which felt surprisingly rare. One afternoon after class, they sat outside drinking coffee. Daniel looked at one of her drawings, then looked back at her. "Can I ask you something?" Susan nodded. "What?" Daniel tapped the sketchbook. "Why did you stop?" The question lingered. Susan stared into her coffee, then answered honestly. "Life got busy." Daniel smiled gently. "Yeah." A pause. "Life does that." For a moment neither spoke. Then Daniel added, "But sometimes, life gives things back." Susan looked down at her artwork. At the dream she'd abandoned. At the woman she was slowly rediscovering. And for the first time since the divorce, the future didn't seem empty anymore. It seemed possible. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Michael Parker was beginning to discover that starting over wasn't quite as simple as he'd imagined. Michael Parker had expected many things after his divorce. Freed. Done. Excitement. Adventure. A fresh start. What he didn't expect was how exhausted he felt. Not immediately. At first, everything seemed exactly the way he'd imagined. Maybe even better. Ashley brought energy into every room she entered. She loved spontaneous road trips. Live music. Weekend getaways. New restaurants. New experiences. New everything. At first, Michael found it exciting. After years of routine, excitement felt intoxicating. Like he'd somehow stepped backward in time. Like he'd escaped aging itself. One Saturday morning, Ashley burst into the kitchen. "Hiking trip." Michael looked up from his coffee. "What?" "What?" "Hiking trip." She grinned. 3 miles. Michael laughed. 3 miles. Ashley raised an eyebrow. "That's not exactly Everest." 3 hours later, Michael was questioning every life decision he'd ever made. His knees hurt. His back hurt. His lungs were negotiating their resignation. Ashley stood on a scenic overlook smiling. Michael sat on a rock trying not to die. "You okay?" Michael forced a smile. "Fantastic." Ashley laughed. "You look miserable." "I am miserable." For a moment they both laughed. But something lingered afterward. A tiny, uncomfortable feeling. Ashley was talking about future hiking trips. Future adventures. Future plans. And Michael realized something strange. He wasn't thinking about the future. He was thinking about blood pressure medication. And orthopedic shoes. And whether he should have stretched first. The realization irritated him. Because it followed him everywhere. At restaurants. At airports. At concerts. Ashley seemed to move toward the future. Michael kept glancing backward. Toward comfort. Toward familiarity. Toward things he'd spent years trying to escape. One evening, they attended a dinner party. Friends of Ashley's. Most were in their 30s. A few in their 40s. The conversations moved fast. Technology, din, startups, travel, plans, career changes, future goals. Michael smiled politely, participated when he could. But for the first time, he felt old. Not because anyone treated him badly. Nobody did. Because suddenly he realized he wasn't part of their chapter. He was part of a different one. Driving home that night, Ashley noticed his silence. "You okay?" Michael stared through the windshield. "Yeah." She waited, then smiled. "That's usually not true when people say it like that." Michael laughed softly. "Maybe I'm just tired." Ashley nodded. But neither of them looked convinced. A few weeks later, Michael received a phone call from his daughter Emily. The conversation started normally. Work, back, weather, family updates. Then Emily asked, "Can I ask you something?" Michael already knew he wasn't going to like it. "Sure." A pause. Then, "Were you unhappy with Mom?" Michael tightened his grip on the phone. "That's complicated." Emily sighed. "I know." Silence. Then she quietly added, "I think you're chasing a version of yourself that doesn't exist anymore." The words landed harder than Michael expected. For several seconds, he couldn't answer, because part of him knew she was right. Not entirely. But enough. Enough to hurt. That night, Michael sat alone on the patio. Ashley had gone to bed. The house was quiet. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to ask a question he'd been avoiding. Had he left Susan because he loved Ashley? Or because Ashley represented something else? Youth. Possibility. A second chance. Proof that he wasn't getting old. The answer scared him. Because he wasn't sure anymore. Meanwhile, Susan was changing. Emily occasionally sent pictures. Artwork. Workshops. Sketches. Events. At first Michael barely looked. Then one afternoon, he saw something that stopped him cold. A photograph. Susan standing beside an illustration display. Smiling. Really smiling. Not politely. Not for the camera. Genuinely. The kind of smile he hadn't seen in years. For some reason, that image stayed with him. Because he suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Susan wasn't rebuilding her life around losing him. She was rebuilding her life around finding herself. And those weren't the same thing. A month later, Ashley surprised him. Not with a trip. Not with tickets. With honesty. The dangerous kind. They were sitting on the back porch when she said, "Can I tell you something?" Michael nodded. Ashley stared out at the yard. Then quietly said, "I don't think you were ever really running toward me." Michael felt his chest tighten. Ashley continued, "I think you were running away from something." Neither spoke. Finally Michael asked, "What makes you think that?" Ashley smiled sadly. "Because no matter where we go." She looked at him. "You still seem to be looking over your shoulder." Michael couldn't respond. Because she was right. And they both knew it. Several weeks later, Ashley ended the relationship. Not with anger. Not with betrayal. Not with drama. Just truth. Painful truth. "I care about you." She smiled softly. "But I can't compete with 40 years of someone's life." Michael stared at her, unable to argue. Because she wasn't talking about Susan. She was talking about time. Memory. History. The parts of life nobody can replace. After she left, the apartment felt strangely familiar. Quiet. Empty. Echoing dot. Michael sat alone in the living room. And for the first time since the divorce, he understood something. Leaving hadn't made him younger. It hadn't stopped time. It hadn't solved the fear he'd been carrying. Because the real problem had never been Susan. The real problem was that Michael Parker had spent years terrified of growing old. And now, for the first time, he was finally ready to face it. Meanwhile, Susan's life was about to change in a way neither of them could have imagined. 6 months after walking into Daniel Brooks' workshop, Susan Parker received an email that changed her life. Again. Only this time. In a good way. The message arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Susan almost ignored it. The subject line looked ordinary. "Regarding your submission." She assumed it was another polite rejection. Artists collected those. Writers too. Creative dreams usually came with plenty of rejection. So she took a sip of coffee before opening it. A decision she immediately regretted. Because, halfway through reading, she nearly spilled the entire cup. The publisher wanted her book, not a meeting, not revisions, not another round of consideration. They wanted it. The whole thing. The story. The illustrations. Everything. Susan reread the email 3 times. Then 4. Then 5. Just to make sure she wasn't imagining it. Finally, she called Emily. The second her daughter answered, Susan started crying. "Mom?" Emily immediately sounded worried. "What happened?" Susan couldn't speak. She tried. Failed. Tried again. Finally managed. They want it. Silence. Then, "What?" "The book." Another pause. Then, screaming. Actual screaming. Susan pulled the phone away from her ear, laughing through tears. Emily was crying too now. Neither woman cared, because some dreams take 40 years to arrive. And when they finally do, words become difficult. The book launched the following spring. A small children's story about finding your way home after getting lost. Simple, warm, honest. Very Susan. The local bookstore hosted a signing event. Susan expected maybe 20 people. 30, if she got lucky. Instead, nearly 100 showed up. Friends. Neighbors. Former students. Parents. Grandparents. Children. People she'd never even met. Daniel stood quietly near the back of the room, watching, smiling, exactly where he seemed most comfortable. At one point, a little girl approached the signing table. Couldn't have been older than 8. She held the book tightly against her chest. "Did you draw all these?" Susan nodded. "I did." The little girl smiled. "I want to draw books someday too." Susan stared at her, then smiled. A slow smile. The kind that comes from somewhere deep. "Then you should." The girl grinned and ran back to her mother. For the rest of the day, Susan couldn't stop thinking about her. Because 40 years earlier, that little girl had been her. Later that evening, after everyone left, Susan sat alone at the signing table. Exhausted. Happy. Unending. Overwhelmed. Daniel approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this." Susan laughed. "You're a good man." Daniel handed her a cup, then looked around the empty bookstore. "You know," Susan smiled. "What?" Daniel shrugged. "Turns out life isn't finished at 60. Susan laughed. "Good." A pause. "Because I just got started." Across town, Michael sat alone in his apartment, holding a copy of Susan's book. Emily had mailed it to him. Without a note. Without a message. Just the book. For a long time, he simply stared at the cover. Susan's name printed beneath the title. A dream he'd never fully understood. A dream she'd almost forgotten herself. Eventually he opened it, turned the pages, read every word, studied every illustration. And somewhere near the end, he found the dedication page. The words were simple. "For everyone who believes it's too late, and for the people who helped me find my way back to myself." Michael closed the book, his eyes burning. Because for the first time, he truly understood what Susan had lost, and what she'd found. Not because he left. Not because she suffered. Because she finally gave herself permission to matter. Several weeks later, a local art gallery hosted an exhibition featuring Susan's original illustrations. The event attracted far more attention than anyone expected. Especially Susan. That evening, as guests wandered through the gallery, Susan stood quietly beside one of her favorite pieces. A painting she'd nearly thrown away years ago. Daniel appeared beside her, hands in pockets, comfortable, as always. "You nervous?" Susan smiled. "A little." Daniel nodded. Good. She laughed. Good. Means you still care. Before Susan could respond, she noticed someone entering the gallery and immediately froze. Michael. He looked older. Not dramatically. Just honestly. Like a man who had finally stopped pretending time wasn't happening. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, neither moved. Then Michael slowly walked over. Hi, Susan. Susan smiled politely. Hi, Michael. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. No speeches. No shouting. No movie scene. Just two people, standing in front of a life they'd once shared. Michael glanced around the gallery, then back at her. This is incredible. Susan looked at the paintings, the guests, the dream she'd finally reclaimed, and smiled. Thank you. A silence followed. Comfortable. Awkward. Sad. Peaceful. All at once. Finally, Michael spoke. I owe you an apology. Susan looked at him, then gently shook her head. No? Oh. Michael frowned. No? Susan smiled softly. You already apologized. A pause. And honestly, she looked around the gallery. I don't need anything from you anymore. The words weren't cruel. That was what made them powerful. They were simply true. Michael nodded slowly, because he understood. Maybe for the first time. I really am happy for you. Susan believed him. That surprised her. But she did. Before leaving, Michael glanced toward Daniel, who was politely pretending not to listen. Michael smiled. You seem happy. Susan followed his gaze, then smiled too. I am. Michael nodded. A little sadness, a little relief, a little gratitude. Then he quietly said, Good, and walked away. Susan watched him leave, not with anger, not with regret, not with longing, just appreciation for a chapter that had ended. Daniel stepped beside her. Everything okay? Susan smiled, then slipped her arm through his. Yeah. Wanyan. She looked around the gallery, at the paintings, at the people, at the life she almost missed. Everything's okay. And maybe that was the lesson. Not that Michael was evil. Not that Susan won. Not that life punishes mistakes. The lesson was simpler. Sometimes people lose themselves. Sometimes they find themselves again. Sometimes those journeys happen together. Sometimes they happen apart. Michael spent years running from aging, until he finally accepted it. Susan spent years putting herself last, until she finally stopped. Neither journey was easy. Both cost something. Both taught something. And in the end, forgiveness wasn't about going backward. It wasn't about getting another chance. It wasn't about pretending nothing happened. Forgiveness was simply letting go of the weight, so you could keep moving forward. As the gallery lights glowed warmly around them, Susan looked toward the future, not with fear, not with regret, but with quiet excitement, because at 63 years old, she had finally become the person she'd always meant to be.
Subscribe my channel Timeless Tales Story and press the bell icon for more inspiring stories.